Hey folks, welcome to Great Books, Big Ideas. I'm Jim. Thanks for joining me. It's time for a reading update. It's Friday, February 7th, 2025, and I've finished some books, and I have a lot of books I'm currently reading that I want to share with you. So this is just a sort of a catch-up video, a Friday Reads for Friday, February 7th. I hope everyone's doing well. One book I finished was The Clouds by Aristophanes. This is a play, a comic play by the Greek playwright. And I covered this in my Great Books of the Western World reading plan. So I won't go into great detail on it here because you can watch a whole video about that. But basically that play was very entertaining, very funny. I read it in the second edition, the 1990 edition of the Great Books of the Western World. I prefer that translation to the 1952 edition. So if you're looking to choose, I would go with that one. Very readable. It was fun to read the passages out loud. I can get into the characters and stuff. It was a lot of fun. So I finished that. And I also finished Swann's Way by Marcel Proust in the Lydia Davis translation and the Penguin Deluxe Classics paperbacks that have come out over the last 10, 20 years, 15 years. And that was great. And I did another video exclusively about that, so I won't go into detail. But I'll maybe link to these videos in the show description if you want to find out more, if you haven't watched them yet. But the Proust project continues, and it's going really well. It's just a total joy. I also finished this book, The Poems of Sir Philip Sidney. This is an Oxford University Press edition. It's quite old. It was originally part of the University of Delaware Library. I got it used during my college years in the 1980s, and 1962 was the publication date. Here is Sir Philip himself. And I finally got around to reading all these poems in here. I would say I have mixed feelings about it. I think Sidney is certainly a very important Elizabethan age poet. He has a very important essay that he wrote. Is it called The Defense of Poetry? As a sort of an apology for poetry. That is in literary criticism, that's an important work to read. It's not in this volume. This is all poems. And it's a scholarly edition, so it's heavily commented on. But he was known as an innovator, an experimenter. He was introducing new verse forms into English language poetry. He was experimenting with different kinds of meter and rhyme schemes and all the rest of it. So he's certainly in British literary history, he's absolutely, I think, an essential poet to be familiar with. To read all of his poems, they were okay. I just have mixed feelings about it. With this older poetry, it's hit or miss for me. The one book, if you would call it, that was most interesting in this collection was Astrophil and Stella, which is a sonnet sequence that Sidney wrote about a real woman. And the extensive notes in here, who did the commentary and the editing, he did a tremendous job. William A. Ringler Jr. Really did his homework and, comparing all the different editions. It's really more detail than you would need. This is a book more for scholars than for general readers. But Astrophil and Stella is an important sonnet sequence. I was exposed to it and read a few poems from it in my British Literature Survey course as a freshman all the way back in 1982, fall of 1982. I remember it well. Dr. Paul Green. And I was intrigued by those poems, and I'm always into love poetry and unrequited love poetry and things like that. So it piqued my interest, but I never got around to reading the whole sequence till just like a month ago. And I have to say, like, I don't know if it was worth the wait. Like, it was okay. There were definitely some cool poems. One of them I featured on a Poetry Thursday episode. And what struck me about that sonnet sequence was it felt sincere. It was like this was a man who really had fallen for a woman who ended up marrying someone else. I think he didn't fall in love with her until, and now I can't remember the history. He might have been like potentially engaged to her, but he didn't really know her yet. And, they were like arranging marriages and stuff amongst the upper crust of British society. But she ended up marrying someone else, and I think that's when he fell in love with her. So she was already taken. And, everything's coded in here. So Astrophil is Philip Sidney, and Stella is the woman, the historical woman that he fell in love with. I forget what her real name is. But it's all covered in this scholarly edition. But the poems felt sincere. Like, I felt like, yes, he truly was smitten with her, longing for her, and was going through the ups and downs. It's quite similar to the sonnets of Shakespeare, I think, in that regard, which, have like two beloveds in that sequence. But I think the Shakespeare sonnets are so much better than the Sidney sonnets overall. Just some of the verses felt a little contrived, a little awkward, not always polished. But on the whole, I'm glad I read it, but I'm kind of, what took me so long? Like, I was kind of, you talk about delayed gratification. It wasn't like super gratifying. It wasn't really worth the wait. But anyway, I'm going to move on from this volume, and I am going to give it away. I'll donate it. So I wasn't sure, but then once I finished Astrophil and Stella, I was pretty certain, like, I'm not gonna keep it. There are also some like translations of the Psalms from the Bible in here, which were interesting. But in fact, I could maybe read one sample from this, just because it's such the most famous of the Psalms. You can compare Sidney's translation to the King James Version, and that would be Psalm 23. And I'll read it for you quickly, and then I'll just make a quick comment on it. So this is the psalm that starts in the King James Version. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Here's Sidney's rendering. The Lord, my shepherd is, and so can never I taste misery. He rests me in green pasture his. By waters still and sweet, he guides my feet. He me revives, leads me the way which righteousness doth take, for his name's sake. Yea, though I should through valleys stray of death's dark shade, I will no whit fear ill. For thou, dear Lord, thou me bestest. Thy rod and thy staff be to comfort me. Before me thou a table setst, even when foes' envious eye doth it espy. With oil thou dost anoint my head, and so my cup dost fill that it doth spill. Thus shall all my days be fed. This mercy is so sure it shall endure, and long, yea, long abide I shall, there where the Lord of all doth hold his hall. And hopefully you can hear, I didn't do the best reading of that, but that doesn't hold a candle to the King James Version. That super famous, legendary poem that a lot of people know by heart. That does not trip lightly off the tongue. Like, I was stumbling over all those inversions, like so much inverted syntax and forced rhymes yeah, not his best moment there, but it was intriguing to like see how he handled the Psalms. I would say Astrophil and Stella was the highlight of the collection for me, his collected poems. But even that was spotty. All that being said, Sidney's an important poet, and I'd say any student of English language literature should be familiar with him. But to be honest, what I get out of anthologies is probably good enough, and it would be good enough for most readers, I suppose. So that was a finished book, another one of my finished books recently. And then I also finished the collected fictions by Jorge Luis Borges. And let me grab that off the shelf. I'll be right back. Okay, I found it. Here is Jorge Luis Borges' collected fictions, translated by Andrew Hurley. And here is our, it's a Penguin Deluxe Classics edition. There's Borges, he's on the spine. I was looking for his picture. And nice edition. Yeah, I'm not really totally thrilled with the cover design of these collected works of Borges, but they're okay. I like the spines. And it was really fun to read this collection, like read pretty much everything he wrote fiction-wise. I would say, in some sense, like the Sidney, this was a bit of a mixed reaction for me. What I found to be true was the stories that I already knew by Borges, these are the ones that often get anthologized. And I had read a couple selected collections of his. Like that really is his best work. And those are the ones that jumped out at me, and they popped, and they're like, wow, these really are good. I can understand why they get anthologized so often. And then the other stuff, it felt like a lot of filler. Like, you know, when we bought, you know, like classic rock albums, there would be the singles. There might be 2 or 3 singles on the album, and then deep tracks and then some album filler, right? There's a lot of album filler here. Stuff that's like, you know, written in his inimitable style, but not really, it didn't feel as deep. It didn't feel as like, it didn't stick with me as much. So that was not entirely expected. Like I thought I would discover even more stories to like, but you know, I'm just going to scrape through the contents here and tell you what for me are the highlights. I'm eyeballing this, so forgive me. I'm probably going to skip over some stuff. Like his first collection in Universal History of Iniquity from 1935, like none of those stories really, this felt like early work and nothing really like super memorable there. Then you get into the 1944 collection of fictions, which is split into 2 sub-collections, The Garden of Forking Paths of 1941 and Artifices of 1944. And here now we hit Borges' stride. So Tlan Ukbar Orbis Tertius, awesome story. Pierre Menard, author of The Quixote, awesome. The Circular Ruins, one of my all-time favorite Borges stories. The Lottery in Babylon, terrific. The Library of Babel, great story. The Garden of Forking Paths, also one of my top Borges stories. I think I only left off like one story from that whole collection that wouldn't make, you know, my top Borges list. So yeah, a great collection there. And Artifices, then there's not as much here that jumps out. Like maybe 3 versions of Judas and The South. The South was one of the first Borges stories I read. I read it for a class in college, and that was a good one. But Artifices was not as strong as The Garden of Forking Paths. And then you get to the Aleph of 1949, And here, were there any highlights? Pretty much the Aleph, the title story, which is a favorite of mine. Like, that was very, very good. There's probably a couple other good ones in here, but there are so many stories here. He tends to write pretty short stories, so it's hard to keep them all sorted. And his themes are so common, like his stories are filled with labyrinths and knife fights and, bookish people who are kind of like counterparts of one another, and mirrors, and like kind of a lot of stories about fluid identity and what is real and what is not real, that kind of thing. Definite magic realist. Then we have this collection, The Maker, 1960. Dream Tigers was okay. Let's see what else. Borges and I, terrific. There's a story here called In Memoriam, JFK, which struck me as pretty good, and that was pretty good. And then we get to the In Praise of Darkness, 1969. Again, none of these stories like pop for me. Not that they're bad, but it just wasn't like, nothing was like vying for like space in that like top tier of Borges stories for me. Brody's Report, 1970. The Duel and the Other Duel were pretty good. The Gospel According to Mark was a pretty cool story. And then The Book of Sand, 1975. Maybe A Weary Man's Utopia. I think that was pretty cool. I like that title too. The Book of Sand was good. And Shakespeare's Memory, his last collection, 1983. The story Shakespeare's Memory was good. So honestly, like, you have to be kind of a hardcore Borges fan to want this. I think that a lot of general readers would be very well served by picking up a smaller collection of his fiction, which hits the highlights. So, for example, here is a New Directions paperback called Labyrinths, Selected Stories and Other Writings by Jorge Luis Borges, edited by Donald A. Yates and James E. Irby, with a preface by Andre Morat. And let me run down the table of contents for this. This is a New Directions paperback that was original copyright 62. This particular edition is 1964. But here are like a list of the stories, and you'll the Tlon Uqbar Orbis Tertius, The Garden of Forking Paths, The Lattery in Babylon, Pierre Menard, author of The Quixote, The Circular Runes, The Library of Babel. Sound familiar? Right? Those are all great, relatively early stories. Funes the Memorias, The Shape of the Sword. I think The Shape of the Sword was pretty good. Theme of the Traitor and the Hero, Death on the Compass, The Secret Miracle, Three Versions of Judas, The Sect of the Phoenix, The Immortal, The Theologian, Story of the Warrior and the Captive, Amazons, The House of Asturion, Deutsch Requiem, Averroes' Search, The Zahir, The Waiting, and The God's Script. So it's really a generous portion of his fiction. And I think there's maybe a few stories, like I would put The South in here, but they didn't do that one. But you're getting a really nice sampling of his work there. So you probably don't need to read the collected fictions unless you're a diehard Borges, in which case you're probably not even watching this because you already have the book. Also, there are essays and parables in here, and a chronology and a bibliography. So Borges and I is in here. So yeah, there are other ones. I think one of the channels I subscribe to, Book Ramble, is Mark in New Zealand. Like, he featured, I think there's a Penguin collection called The Garden of Forking Paths. That's probably good. I don't know all the stories in that, but there are other collections by Borges. So I think you would be well served by going in that direction. Okay, that's pretty much everything I've finished reading in the last couple weeks. Now let's get to what I'm currently reading. I'll try to run through these quickly. I'm still reading Redwall and I'm over halfway through it now, and I'm enjoying it quite a bit. I don't know why it's taking me so long to get through it. It reads very easily, but I guess it's because I have so many other books I'm juggling. But yeah, really enjoying this nice sort of childlike fantasy, and it's good storytelling for sure. On my Kobo e-reader, I'm reading Praeterita by John Ruskin, which just seems endless. Like, I don't dislike it. It's a memoir. Memoirs are generally easy to read. He likes to write about himself a lot, but we're moving so slowly through his life and career, and I'm just a little over halfway through it. Yeah, there's some other things on the Kobo I'm reading, but I won't talk about them right now. What else am I currently reading? Well, I started In the Shadow of Young Girls in Flower by Marcel Proust, and isn't that a lovely cover? You can see the shine. Penguin Deluxe Classics. And this is translated by James Grieve. Different translator. Lydia Davis did Swann's Way. James Grieve does this one. Different translator for every volume in the set. Yeah, I'm making like good progress here. Reading my 10 to 20 pages a day. Loving it. Just loving it. This is, well, the first time through Proust, this was one of my favorite volumes. Volume 2. And it's holding up pretty well. I also went back to an anthology that I haven't picked this up since like about a year ago, but I'm trying to go back to some of these books that have been in the parking garage for all this time. And this is The Future is Female. More classic science fiction stories by women. So this is volume 2, the 1970s. I read volume 1, which focused on the 60s. And I think I gave that away. Volume 1 looks like this, has a really cool cover. These are very nice dust jackets. And these are Library of America titles. And a Library of America special publication. Lisa Yazek is the editor. And these are just cool sci-fi stories by women. And I've read a couple stories to sort of pick up where I left off. The one I just finished was like really a good one, and it was called Pale Hands, written in 1974 by Doris Perseccia. That was a really good one. James Tiptree Jr. is in here. Kate Wilhelm is in here. Some names I'm familiar with, but most of these other ones I'm not familiar with at all. So this is a great introduction to women in sci-fi. And I'm just now about to start an Ursula K. Le Guin story called The Day Before the Revolution. And I have maybe about 10 or 12 more stories to read in this. So I'm going to try to get through this. And it's nice to have some short stories to read. Most of my short story energy was focused on Borges, but now that I'm through Borges, when I want to read shorter form fiction, I turn to that and some other things. So that's pretty cool. Also, where is it? I'm kind of creeping back into John Irving, The Cider House Rules. Still not too far into it so far, still 71 pages in. Really digging it though. I mean, it's very well done so far. So I'll have more to say about that once I get more farther along. And then I decided to, for Black History Month, read this Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself by Harriet Jacobs. And I'm making good initial progress through it. It reads easy. It's a harrowing story about growing up as a slave, and I will want to do a more extensive review on this. I'll probably devote a separate video to it once I finish it. nice Penguin Classics edition. And then I thought it was time to dig back into the great books of the Western world and continue my long march. And so now I'm reading the Discourses of Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher, a Roman Stoic philosopher, a former slave. And I'm still only in book one, but I won't talk too much about it right now, but I like it so far. It's interesting. Like, I want to make some comparisons to Socrates a little bit once I get through the whole thing, but it's definitely readable and enjoyable. But I'm sort of reading it slowly and letting it, I'm savoring it. And then I started Euclid's Elements. A little bit of geometry, not a little bit, a lot of geometry, a hell of a lot of geometry here. This one's going to take a while, but you see, it takes you through all the propositions, the postulates, and what I try to do is just follow the logic as best I can. And it really helps that there's figures in there, because without that, I would be totally screwed. So I would say that's more like kind of like a daily regimen where I just sort of read a page or two, get through those postulates, those proofs, and then I put the bookmark in and I set it aside until the next day. It feels like it's exercising my mind, and that's not a bad thing. Okay, then two more to feature here. This is a book that's been in a parking garage for about a year. It's a book I found in the little free library, Lewis Mumford, The Myth, the Machine, The Pentagon of Power. And there's Lewis Mumford. And I'm only 60 pages in. I think Lewis Mumford's a very fine writer, and what a thinker he was. But it's like every sentence is meaningful. So like I can't read him fast. Like I have to kind of really digest him slowly as I go by. And I do get a little drowsy when I'm reading him. But this book, I know I talked about this about a year ago on the channel, but it's the climax of a series of studies that he began in 1934. I think this came out in the 60s or 1970. And it's talking about technology and society, basically, and power and politics and culture. And yeah, it's great food for thought. But, it's thinking at a high level, so I'm taking my time with it. And then I guess finally, I'll bring this one. This was a little library find. So I was watching a channel, Holly, at the channel Oh Hello Holly. Holly's been a faithful viewer for a while now, and we're YouTube buddies, BookTube buddies, and I'm going to throw a link to her channel and the video I was watching recently, where she mentioned the work of Beverly Cleary, and the mouse and the motorcycle, and what's the other one? Runaway Ralph. And lo and behold, here's serendipity at work again. I found the third Ralph book, Ralph S. Mouse, which I had not read. I'm pretty sure I read the first two. And this is Beverly Cleary, a Del Yearling book, Ralph S. Mouse. So I grabbed it out of the little library and I thought, I'm going to read this and then I'll give it back when I'm done. It's a real nostalgia trip, even though I haven't read this particular volume. So let me read the copy off the back. Ralph Smart Mouse is fed up with living at the country inn with his rowdy mouse cousins who always want to ride his motorcycle. When his pal Ryan Bramble takes him to school, Ralph is delighted with his new home and instant rise to fame. But Ralph doesn't like it one bit when he's in a mouse exhibit, and a reporter writes that there are mice throughout the school. What's worse is Ryan's quarrels with his classmate Brad, who ends up breaking Ralph's motorcycle. Can anything replace his treasured motorcycle? Why can't they all be friends? So here is Ralph S. Mouse by Beverly Cleary. And this is like pretty much a nostalgia trip, isn't it? I like to read, just as I'm reading Redwall, which was more like my daughter's era. I remember she was really into those books, and I had never read any Brian Jacques. But I have nostalgia for like when she was little and reading those books. This is back to my day. A little later, actually. When this came out, the public is illustrated by Paul Zielinski. Here's one. There's Ralph on his motorcycle. This is 1982, so I would have been like a senior in high school, which is probably why I didn't even know about this book. But the earlier books I did read and I liked. So it's just a fun to walk down memory lane with books like this and get back in touch with your childhood. Anyway, that is my reading update. Thanks for bearing with me on that. Lots of interesting stuff. And I hope you're having successful reading year so far. Let me know what you've been finishing or are actively reading at the moment. If you have any comments about these books. If you have favorite Borges stories, let me know. And I'm curious of what people think about Sidney as well. So with that, I will check out, and I hope everyone's doing well. Oh, and one last thing. Go Eagles. Go Birds.